Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series on one of medicine's most important and glamorous fields. A story of adventure, controversy, and the pioneers of surgery. This week, the heart, once thought too delicate for the knife, yields to science, and surgeons begin to go into the heart.
Funding for Nova is provided by Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for Nova is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
The surgeons and doctors in the Second World War were faced with injury and suffering on a grand scale. Yet out of this carnage came advances in medicine which would go on saving lives after the war was over. The demands of war forced through the development of antibiotics, the use of better anesthesia, and large-scale blood transfusion. Yet for all this, the 1945 operating room was a simple place with little elaborate equipment. The surgeon was essentially a craftsman who had learned his skill by apprenticeship. Few could have realized that surgery was about to enter a golden age. In the next 25 years, almost everything would change. Surgeons would achieve miracle after miracle, would rise to the top of the medical hierarchy, and become public figures of fame and glamour. One branch of surgery would be in the vanguard of this revolution, a branch which in 1945 simply didn't exist, the surgery of the heart. Throughout history, the heart had been regarded as a forbidden organ, too delicate to tamper with. Great and influential figures like Professor Billroth of Vienna vilified those who dared to try.
So they tried very bold things like opening the chest and trying to do something in the heart. And because they really didn't understand the physiology of respiration very well, as soon as they opened the chest, the lung would collapse. And they say, whoa, that's great. That gets the lung out of the way so they could get to the heart. And then what happened, as soon as they touched the heart, it would start to fibrillate, or it would stop. And the whole thing was a disaster. And after they did that 2 or 3 times, they'd catch on. Doesn't seem to be a good idea. And that's why Billroth said that. And this kind of thinking from as great a man as Billroth dominated the surgical community right up into the period of time that I started to train.
And yet a vast pool of human disease lay completely untreated. Crippled children born with congenital heart disorders, breathless and blue, and condemned to an early death. Victims of rheumatic fever, whose heart valves were narrowed or stuck. At the time, nothing could be done.
Well, I can remember seeing, for example, patients with mitral stenosis in the 30s. Mitral stenosis is narrowing of the mitral heart valve. They were all put off in kind of a dying hospital. It was tragic. They were young people, mostly in their teens, and they were very blue from their disease, and there was nothing that could be done. They would just die.
From this one organ with its complex anatomy came so much suffering, and yet the surgeon couldn't get near it.
Well, you've got a 4-chambered heart with it's got its 4 valves too, because the blood's got to come in one end, work its way through the right side, first one collecting chamber, through a valve, into a pumping chamber, through a valve and into the lungs. From the lungs, it has to come again into a collecting chamber, through a valve, into the high-pressure pumping chamber, out through a valve, and around the rest of your body, and back. Now that's the four-chambered system. Now you can imagine any combination of odd things have been listed. Holes where there shouldn't be, between two chambers, between the two collecting chambers, between the two high-pressure pumping chambers, in all kinds of directions. Even hearts all twisted and single-chambered hearts. There is almost no anatomical funny situation that hasn't been recorded. Now, some of those are quite incompatible with life, and of course, the baby doesn't survive.
The litany of complaints is vast. Valves which become stuck or narrowed. Holes between the upper chambers of the heart, so that the oxygen-rich red blood mixes with the blue blood. And much more serious, holes between the lower chambers, the high-pressure pumping chambers. If the surgeons couldn't get at the heart, nothing could be done. It might have remained so, but for some extraordinary events that took place in Britain at the end of the war. Many young soldiers were being evacuated from the European front with shell fragments and bullets lodged inside their hearts. To leave them there was dangerous, but to try to remove them was surely fatal. But one man, a young U.S. Army surgeon, Dwight Harkin, had the courage to try. Proceeding very carefully, he cut into the wall of the heart while it was still beating, having secured the area with stitches. Then, inserting his finger, he located the fragments and set about removing them. It was very risky and went against centuries of tradition.
And here's a missile with a piece of the boy's uniform on it. These are horrible things. Here are some bullets. These were all taken from the chambers of the heart. There were many pieces of hand grenades, bullets, shell fragments of various sizes and shapes. The first 14 I operated on and did something on the inside of the heart all died. The second, 7 of the 14 died. The third, 2 of the 14 died. I was getting better, but the fourth 14 all survived. And the only difference between these first 3 groups and the fourth group are these were all animals, and the 14th and the final group were all American soldiers, and they all survived.
Within days, the soldiers were up on their feet, living proof that the heart that beat inside them was not a delicate, fragile organ unsuited for surgery. But could this knowledge be put to any practical use in peacetime? Could lives be saved? They might if he could use the technique to reach the heart valves. Vast numbers of people suffered from valves that didn't open and shut properly like this, but were stuck or narrowed. For the first time, there was a chance of helping them. In 1948, within days of each other, Dwight Harkin and a Philadelphia surgeon, Charlie Bailey, independently reported on a daring procedure to try and correct mitral stenosis, a hitherto incurable condition where the mitral valve is narrowed and won't open properly. Just as with the soldiers, after opening the chest, a small hole was cut in the side of the heart, and a finger or cutting instrument inserted to find and very carefully widen the narrowed valve. But the early results were disastrous.
The first ones went very, very badly. I lost 6 of my first 10 patients and decided I would never again do heart surgery. I came home, was terribly depressed, went to bed, told my wife I would never do another heart operation. My greatest supporter was Lawrence Brewster Ellis, the most distinguished cardiologist. He came by, our families were friends, we all knew each other, and he said, "Ann, Dwight tells me he's never going to do another heart operation. Could I talk to him?" She said, "No, I think he's too depressed tonight. Try tomorrow." He came back the next day, and he came up to my room and said, "I think this is a terribly irresponsible thing. You've said you would never operate on the heart again." He said, "I think that's awful." I said, "Awful? Hell, no respectable cardiologist would ever send me a patient again." He said, "No, no, no. You must have learned a lot in those 6 deaths. I would send you patients, and I'm generally regarded as respectable. I'm president of the Heart Association. I said, well, if you're courageous enough to do it, I'll try again. And only one patient was lost in the next 15 operations.
The valve, which is a good deal smaller than normal, is now being operated upon by my finger. The cusps have been well separated, and the heart, which shows some quickening in its action after this procedure, will rapidly settle down to its normal rhythm without causing anxiety.
This kind of blind surgery, or closed heart surgery, spread. The heart carried on beating throughout, and the surgeon never saw the inside of a human heart. With practice, surgeons became very skillful at the technique, and soon it became very safe. But impressive as it was, it made little difference to the majority who suffered with heart defects.
It remains to close this incision, and fine stitches are used for this purpose.
For the vast numbers of children with congenital heart disorders, the surgeon could do nothing. The worst by far was a multiple defect where the child was blue and had clubbing of the fingers. This so-called blue baby syndrome arose from a combination of 4 heart defects. The valve leading to the lungs is stuck, and the pulmonary artery behind it is greatly narrowed, restricting the flow of blue blood to the lungs, which failed to develop properly. Pumping harder and harder against the obstruction, the right side heart wall becomes thickened and distorts the shape of the heart. Finally, there is a hole between the 2 pumping chambers, and blue and red blood, which should stay separate, mix. There was no way a child could survive to adulthood with these multiple defects. The Baltimore surgeon, Alfred Blaylock, devised an ingenious operation which eased the condition. He bypassed the obstructed pulmonary artery and shunted blood to the lungs. But this was only a temporary solution which gave the child a few more years of life. To correct the defects properly meant cutting open the heart, open heart surgery. Yet an open heart empty of blood cannot sustain life. Most surgeons thought it impossible to do open heart surgery without killing the patient. But a few pioneers were prepared to try.
It was very risky and required a very special kind of personality. People who had enormous self-confidence, who understood what they wanted to do so well that they understood that it could be done.
In Minneapolis, there was a great surgeon, Owen Wangenstein, who liked to say that no problem was impossible. He made the University of Minnesota into a major center for surgery and attracted a group of brilliant young surgeons, all anxious to do research on impossible problems. His most celebrated protege was Walton Lillehei. Lillehei became the archetype of the heart surgeon. He exemplified the kind of personality one needed: resilience, self-confidence, a man undaunted by failure. And it was in this operating room 35 years ago that Lillehei and his colleagues set out to do the impossible.
If you cut off the inflow into the heart so it becomes empty, you have 4 minutes that you can stop the circulation safely by clamping the inflow, and once the heart's emptied in a beat or two, the circulation's effectively stopped. There's no more circulation. And the 4 minutes relates to the sensitivity of the brain to oxygen deprivation. Now, you can't do much in 4 minutes.
Lillehei and his colleagues weren't alone. The goal of open-heart surgery attracted the brightest and the best of a new generation of research-minded surgeons like Adrian Kantrowitz in New York, or in London, Dennis Melrose. But it was a young Canadian surgeon, Bill Bigelow, who came up with the first workable, if highly bizarre, suggestion. He had been struck by the way in which hibernating animals like groundhogs reacted to the bitterly cold Canadian winters. Their heartbeats slowed. They survived without food for months. It was as if cold made time run more slowly. Wondering whether cold might be the key to operating inside the heart, Bigelow began animal experiments and found when dogs were cooled, Open heart surgery could be done for long periods, much longer than 4 minutes, and they didn't die. The idea attracted the attention of Lillehei and his war buddy, Surgeon John Lewis. Lewis, after doing lots of animal experiments, resolved to try it on humans, and Lillehei assisted him. On September 2nd, 1952, a 5-year-old girl, Jackie Weeks, with a hole in her heart, was brought in for surgery. Wrapped in a special cooling blanket and anesthetized to stop her shivering, she was cooled until her body temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, she would survive without a pumping heart for 10 minutes, not 4. Then, clamping the inflow to her heart so that it emptied of blood, they cut open the heart, still slowly beating, and quickly sewed up the hole inside her heart, which had caused all the trouble. With a repaired heart working properly for the first time in her life, she was immersed in a bath of warm water to bring her body temperature back to normal.
I remember looking up at the clock. It was about 10 minutes to 10 when the heart took over. I said, "This is it, John. We're into the heart to stay."
Modern heart surgery had arrived. A girl facing certain early death would now live and grow up to have 2 children of her own. The doctors who had said it was impossible were proved wrong. This frozen state was called hypothermia, and bizarre though it seemed, it offered incredible promise. By cooling the patient, the surgeon stretched time. At lower temperatures, the tissues of the body and brain didn't need as much oxygen and could survive without oxygenated blood for longer. But there was a snag. If the heart was cooled too far, it stopped and couldn't be started again.
It really did look extremely exciting, and it's disappointing in some sense that man is not a hibernator and will not behave like one. But anyway, it did lead to a huge and very important period in heart surgery, when with modest change of temperature from the normal of around 37 degrees centigrade to about, let's say, 30, just a small drop of 7 or 8 degrees, you could guarantee that the heart need not function for 9 minutes instead of 3, 10 minutes instead of 4, that sort of thing. And 10 minutes was time enough to do certain operations inside the heart.
That hypothermic approach was one approach that was developed and used very successfully, particularly in small defects that had to be fixed. For instance, an interatrial septal defect, I'm sorry, I don't mean to get complicated. That is a hole between the 2 chambers of the upper part of the heart, which may be the size of a quarter. Well, in the United States, a quarter is about 2 centimeters in diameter. And then it was possible to open the heart by, after producing hypothermia, by lowering the temperature and stopping the circulation. You could sew such a thing up in 5 minutes, literally, and do it precisely and carefully, and then close the heart in another 2 minutes and start the circulation up. And all you had to do was interrupt for 7, 8, 10 minutes. And the hypothermia gave you enough of a leeway whereby you could do these kinds of procedures.
But surgeons sometimes opened hearts to find complex defects which couldn't be repaired in 10 minutes. With the clock ticking away, they found themselves unable to finish what they had started.
10 minutes is not very much time to do a complicated operation. And imagine the sensation you have when you find your time is running out and you haven't completed your job yet. I didn't like it, though I did a lot of operations that way, yes.
So hypothermia was not the final answer. Some surgeons argued that proper access to the open heart would only come through an even more audacious approach, an approach which saw the heart simply as a mechanical object whose function could be replaced with a man-made alternative.
The heart is particularly ideal, and even though I didn't quite understand it to that depth, because it does essentially one thing, and that is to pump blood. Oh, I know that it's supposed to be the organ of love and the site of the soul. I don't know anything about the soul. As far as love is concerned, I think there are better organs for that. But certainly it is a pump. And if it is a pump, one can reproduce that function, at least for a period of time, which will permit you to get into the heart and do some very obvious repairs that are necessary.
The idea of building a machine to take over the function of the heart and lungs had been proposed by surgeon John Gibbon before the war.
In the 1930s, he saw some operations for taking a pulmonary embolus out of the pulmonary artery. That's a great big clot. It's come from the legs up to the heart. And those patients all died. And he said to his boss, Dr. Churchill, he said, well, what we need is a way of taking the blood out and pumping it around to keep the patient alive during the operation. Well, no one thought it would work. I like to tell the story of the time we went to see Dr. Gibbon, and at that time his pump oxygenator was about the size of a concert grand piano, and it was used to support the circulation of a little cat about this big. It was quite remarkable. And he had us put rubber boots on, and pretty soon we noticed that we were sloshing around, and we looked down and the floor was flooded with blood. His machine required buckets of blood to prime it, and he, in his usual good spirit, says, uh-oh, we've got a leak again this morning. He could laugh at it. Not many people would have.
Others shared Gibbon's dream, like Dennis Melrose in London. The dream of building a machine to take over the job of the heart and lungs, allowing the surgeon access to the open heart.
Here is a pump. By this rotation, blood is brought up these tubes, through here, and into the bags. And then, by wiping the blood across the surface of the bags, the blood is spread.
These primitive machines were usually vast, cumbersome, and dangerous things which leaked blood and damaged blood cells. They consisted of a pump to pump blood and some means of adding oxygen to the blood to turn it red and cleanse it of carbon dioxide. They were called heart-lung machines, or pump oxygenators, and surgeons were anxious to try them on human patients. The first success went to the pioneer John Gibbon. In 1953, he succeeded in closing a hole in this young woman's heart. But this solitary success was followed by failure after failure. So bad were the results that many surgeons stopped. A view became widespread that major open-heart surgery was doomed. Strangely, most surgeons didn't blame their machines. They put the failure down to something more fundamental, the sick hearts. Such badly damaged hearts with multiple defects were simply too weak to survive major surgery, or so most surgeons thought. So despite all the advances, Michael Shaw, born with a multiple blue baby disorder, was told he would end up in a wheelchair and die. But Michael Shaw didn't die. Dr. Lillehei, convinced that his case was operable, saved his life in 1954 with the help of this man, Howard Holtz. Michael's was one of probably the most daring series of operations ever attempted. It involved not one patient, but two. It sent shockwaves through the medical world. On the left, Lillehei operated on the sick child, Michael Shaw. On the right, with a separate surgical team, lay Howard Holtz. His role was to act as a human heart-lung machine, taking the blue blood from Michael's body into his lungs, purifying it and returning it red. Dr. Lillehei was thus given time to repair Michael's damaged heart. If anything went wrong, Howard's life, as well as Michael's, was at stake.
One visiting dignitary, one very great surgeon at that time who I admired greatly, then he seemed quite impressed, and he said, Dr. Lillehei, your name will go down in history. Well, I said, I was elated to hear such a compliment, particularly from an outsider and such a man of eminent stature. He said, yes, your name will go down in history as the first surgeon who ever developed an operation with a 200% mortality. Well, he had a sense of humor, actually, and I later got to know him much better, and we became very good friends, but that was a little bit summarized, I guess, what some people thought. In other words, this was going to be a complete and utter disaster. Not only would the patient die, as in the previous operations, but the donor would probably possibly die.
A parent would have been chosen as a donor, but in Michael's case, this wasn't possible. So they turned to Howard Holtz, a local gravedigger with the same blood group.
I guess I just figured, well, I had three sons. We had 3 sons, Don and I, of our own, and I figured, well, gee whiz, if I can help somebody, I sure hope somebody would do the same for my boys.
I was doing everything I couldn't do before. And I noticed the difference, too, like in my color and my fingernails and lips, because I'd look in the mirror and I knew I looked different. And I felt great.
I was looking at some pictures last night of Michael that we had taken, and I think he was 16 years old then. That was about 6 years after surgery. Mm-hmm. And he looked great. You were playing in the band then, but
okay, yeah.
You went out to get an x-ray, and I asked your mother, I said, well, how's Michael doing now? Is he doing everything? And she said, yes, he certainly is. That's part of the problem. She said he's playing in this band, and he's staying out late at nights, and he's dating a lot of girls. And she said, I'm so worried. She said, before I was worried because he couldn't do anything. Now I'm worried because I'm afraid he's going to get
doing too much.
Too much, to get into some kind of trouble. And she said, you know, sometimes I almost think we shouldn't have had that operation.
Other children are alive today thanks to Lillehei's daring surgery. They are living proof that very sick hearts could survive major open-heart surgery. Yet their cases have become a forgotten episode in surgery's history. Lillehei's method was simply far too risky and controversial to gain acceptance. It wasn't just the risk to the sick child, but the awesome legal consequences of harming a healthy donor.
Let me tell you, the only legal suit that I can recall during my entire time of 6 years at Minnesota came from one of the cross-circulation operations that Walt Lillehei had done. It was really the only complication to a donor. Now, the way the system was arranged, the baby would be operated upon while the circulation was maintained through blood taken from the parent. And on only one case out of about 50 applications of this method, the mother the blood pressure got very low in the mother, and she had a cardiac arrest for a very brief period of time. But nonetheless, she did have some neurological deficit. And so Dr. Lillehei advised this woman, because Lillehei had malpractice insurance, to sue him for some reasonable amount of compensation. Well, the trouble is the lawyers got a hold of it, and instead of suing, say, for a few $100,000, they decided to sue for several $1 million. So the case went to court, and the courts decided that the mother was fully informed of the risks and benefits of the procedure, and therefore no award was made. So this was the kind of legal atmosphere that obtained in those days.
Inspired by what Lillehei had achieved, surgeons returned with new enthusiasm to the task of making a safe heart-lung machine. In this exciting climate, the University of Minnesota at Minneapolis became a mecca for aspiring heart surgeons. Surgeons who would later become household names came here to learn their craft. Christian Barnard, later to be the first man to transplant a human heart. Norman Shumway, now the world's premier heart transplant surgeon. This was where the action was.
It was a hotbed for experimental work. We used to say at the University of Minnesota, you had to invent an operation to get on the operating schedule. And of course, that's just what many of the staff members did.
Despite the research, it took several years before heart-lung machines became safe. Years in which patients died in large numbers from air embolisms and other causes. Only the most resilient surgeons could keep going.
We operated on 1 patient a day, and usually on 5 a week, and often by Friday night, all 5 patients were dead. And it really took a lot of guts to go back the next week and try again and start over again. We lost patients in those days operating on defects that today you have 100% success in. And that's one of Dr. Lillehei, who I work with, one of his His forte was the ability to go back after so much punishment and start again and believe in what he did. And that's how eventually cardiac surgery became, you know, everyday surgery.
When you lose a patient, particularly when you lose a child, and in the early days, much of the heart surgery was done in children, and they don't really understand. They don't really look at the possibility of failure. It is said to them, but it doesn't sink in that it is really possible that this child may die. I think mostly because the medical profession has such an aura about it, that it is magical, that you can accomplish anything. And it is true that maybe other children may die, but not your child, not this time, not with this guy who can talk so well, and who smiles, and who can win your confidence.
And it was a gruesome period. We used to operate on 2 patients, if possible, in a given day, in order that 4 parents could meet and suffer the misery of waiting and waiting and waiting together. There was a lot of other things to it, too, because the congenital child carried a kind of guilt in the parents, too. You know, they hadn't made it properly in some funny way. And to be associated with somebody who also hadn't made it right. And on great days, of course, both children would return to the from the operating room pink and well. Fantastic.
It is not infrequently that you cry with the family, and you do. It is a great, great disappointment to you. It is, it isn't something that you do easily, but you do. You cry with them. You know when the enormous grief, which is explosive at first, is over. And you sit with them and you do what you can, which is nothing. You cannot replace this child. You cannot replace all of the hope that they put in you. But you do it. And then you go and see the patient for the next operation tomorrow. And there have been times when I've had 2 operations scheduled in one day where I have lost the first one and I will cancel the second one. Because even I can't take that.
In 1958, machines had improved sufficiently for California surgeons to present an actual case, Tommy's, live on television.
Because Tommy has so much to gain, his parents and his doctors have decided on this operation. It is only fair that you know, as they do, that there is a risk. Operating within the human heart is complicated, difficult, and dangerous. Until very recently, it was thought to be impossible. KPIX, in cooperation with the San Francisco Medical Society, has arranged for this first live telecast of open heart surgery with the heart-lung machine, so you may better understand modern medicine and surgery. I'm John Weston, your surgery commentator. With me in the operating theater is Dr. Dennis Melrose, a heart surgeon from London, England. Dr. Melrose is the inventor of a heart-lung machine and will assist us by providing a description of the operation as it proceeds.
It began with a newspaper campaign, quite modest but careful, to identify a crippled child. His name was Tommy. He was about 7 years of age, the son of a veteran, you know, typically American, very nicely organized. And one evening at 7 p.m. we started to operate on Tommy and carried on the television, live, until we had finished and Tommy had gone back to the intensive care unit and everybody was having a cup of coffee without a break.
Nothing like it had ever happened before. The real-life medical drama of Tommy's operation held an audience spellbound.
Venous pressure 14. Electrocardiogram good, electroencephalogram good. Blood color has improved.
The intention being to show people in California that there was a lot of complexity to this. It required an enormous team of people. It required, in fact, the acceptance of risk, high risk, and that if, in fact, we had failed in public, it would have been part of the natural statistics available at that time.
Much to the relief of all concerned, Tommy's operation ended successfully.
The operation is now finished, except for the completion of the routine closure of the wound. We'll be able to talk to the surgeon in just a few moments. In the meantime, let's return to the studio.
I watched heart operations in preparation for this program, but this is the first I've seen on television, and I find it quite a moving experience. To look into a heart, to see the surgeon's hands at work, to see this heart mended, and this child given a chance for a longer life.
And then we had the other funny part of it, because the television industry descended on us, because we had done better than Cheyenne, which at the time was getting the best ratings and so on. And none of them could understand how it was possible to block an audience from 7 to 11 without breaking at all.
But it was in Minnesota, at places like the Mayo Clinic, that the greatest strides were made. John Kirkland began to get superb results with his heart-lung machines. And 80 miles away in Minneapolis, Lillehei and his colleagues achieved a design breakthrough, making a simpler and eventually a safer kind of heart-lung machine. A new young doctor had come to work with Lillehei called Dick DeWall. Lillehei suggested he try an unorthodox way of getting oxygen into the blood, by bubbling it in.
Bubbling oxygen into blood to oxygenate it was the one method that every single authority said would not work. It would kill everybody with air embolism. Well, I knew this, of course, but I didn't tell Dick DeWall. I said, Dick, you need to devise a method to get the bubbles out.
With a few tubes and clips and some anti-foam from a mayonnaise manufacturer to get the bubbles out, DeWall built a simple disposable oxygenator. It would go on later to become the most popular oxygenator in the world.
They're now beginning to fill the machine with blood. I see. All this activity is still preparation. During the operation, the pumps perform the functions of the heart, while this system of tubes performs the functions of the lung.
Well, I can see easily enough what the pumps do, but what does the lung do?
Well, a normal lung serves to add oxygen to the blood and remove the gaseous waste products, mostly carbon dioxide.
Well, how does this artificial lung do that?
Well, it collects blood from the venous side of the heart and pumps into the base of the mixing chamber where oxygen is added. And it rises to this debubbler tube. From there, the purified blood drains by gravity into this coil. From there, it is pumped back to the main artery of the body, which bypasses the heart.
And to make heart surgery even simpler, Dennis Melrose in London had invented a way of stopping the heart from beating at all.
We're stopping the heart. Heart stopped now.
Now surgeons had time to work on a heart that not only was empty of blood, but which wasn't moving. They had time to correct even the most serious abnormalities. Holes which were too big to be sewn up were patched. Modern heart surgery was now unstoppable. In 1958, the world's great heart men gathered in Brussels for the Third World Congress of Cardiology to review the amazing progress that had occurred. In under a decade, the heart had been conquered. Most of the major heart disorders could now be repaired surgically. It was still risky, but all the time it was getting safer, thanks to state-of-the-art methods for diagnosing heart conditions, like cardiac catheterization, where a probe was fed into the heart to take blood samples from inside the heart. Some surgeons were already looking beyond repair to replacement. Where valves were damaged beyond hope, artificial mechanical valves were being put in. These consisted of a ball which moved back and forth in a cage, letting blood pass only one way. Now, almost anything seemed possible.
Well, we've now come into the operating theatre. The operation is in progress. I'm just going to point out to you some of the salient features. Here is the anesthetic apparatus with the gas cylinders, the anesthetist behind.
In just 10 years, the operating environment had been transformed from a simple, empty room with almost no equipment into a high-technology palace stuffed full of complex apparatus. And where heart surgery led, all surgery followed.
These pressure gauges send electrical signals to these dials. I want you to look here at the arterial pressure. This is the arterial pressure of the patient.
It introduced the concept of carrying the measuring systems from the diagnostic fields and laboratories into the operating room, because you couldn't fly the plane without the instruments. The moment you attached a heart-lung machine to a man and an anesthetic machine to a man, and you paralyzed him, etc., you had to be responsible for the automatic functions which you've taken over. And you couldn't do that entirely blind. So we had to learn how to measure things, how to measure the pressure in the various chambers. We had to have an electrocardiogram running, because we'd stopping it and starting it, doing things like that. We had to know about the chemistry. We had to actually bring close to the operating room, not the old biochemist who's sitting in his biochemical department, but somebody being able to tell us, you have to adjust that now. And this environment was appalling. I remember so many of my colleagues peering into this maelstrom of people running around doing things. Rather like your television studio, all sorts of unseen people doing things.
Surgery had changed irreversibly. It was now in the forefront of high-technology medicine. And by 1960, the center of heart surgery had moved to Houston, to the Methodist Hospital. And the king of the heart surgeons was Michael DeBakey. Surgery was about to become a media sensation. From nothing, DeBakey built what became the largest heart center in the world. He showed that in a specialized, well-equipped center, safe heart surgery could be delivered on a mass scale. Lives could be saved by the thousand on the production line. Heart disease had by now become recognized as the major killer in the Western world. Not the congenital disorders of children, but the results of Western affluence. Blocked arteries which needed bypassing, weakened arteries that had ballooned out, so-called aneurysms that needed replacing. DeBakey made this field, cardiovascular surgery, his own. Soon, the rich and the famous were flocking to his center. And the media as well.
Michael Ellis DeBakey, 57 years old, surgeon, by appointment to the Duke of Windsor, Prince Otto von Bismarck, musical comedy star Jeanette MacDonald, actors Edmund O'Brien and Clifton Webb, surgeon to the royalty of Europe and the royalty of Hollywood. Michael E. DeBakey, master surgeon, but also a politician, also a man who storms through a 20-hour day, a man they call the Texas Tornado, also a researcher who many people believe will become the first man to implant successfully an artificial heart in a living human being. The artery which carries blood from the heart to the brain and the body is weakened and ballooned out. This morning, Dr. DeBakey will remove the whole artery and replace it with this. It is a tube of knitted plastic called Dacron. The observation dome above the theater is crowded with observers, and no one has attempted such a major replacement before. The success of this operation does not depend only on DeBakey's skill. The general condition of the patient will also affect his chances of survival, which, at the start of such major and controversial surgery, may not be more than 50-50.
The patient in this operation has an aneurysm. The aorta has ballooned out and may rupture at any moment.
No. Put your finger over that. Yeah, don't touch it. Yeah. Somebody's got to do that. You know, do this. Please concentrate on that. This is what you got to do. Nothing else. Don't try to work on anything else. You see? If I've got to keep on telling you that, it distracts me. And it doesn't take much effort to do that.
DeBakey's operation is surgery at its boldest. He first cuts away the diseased tissue that has caused the problem. And then replaces the artery with a plastic spare part.
DuPont had previously come out with Nylon, and more recently around that time had come out with Dacron. And we began to do some experimental work using Dacron. Largely because that's the first material I was able to get from stores downtown. And I would actually cut these in 2 sheets and the sizes I wanted to use. And on my wife's sewing machine, I would sew the edges to make a tube, you see. And we experimented with those and animals and found that they worked. And so in 1954, I put the first one in a human being, following a resection of an ears, and it worked fine.
Yeah. Let me have it. So you're too slow. You know, I can't stand that. You're too slow. I can do it a lot faster than you can. Only the surgeon when I get ready.
So great was DeBakey's reputation for this type of operation that when the Duke of Windsor had an aneurysm, like many of the rich and famous, he made the journey to Houston.
And His Royal High. Our findings were all perfectly normal, and the Duke's condition was found to be excellent in every way.
Well, with all the medical skill of Europe available here, well, why did you come to Houston?
Dr. DeBakey. Oh, but there are a lot of other, you have surgeons you trained here who do it all over the world as well.
That's true.
But I come to the maestro.
In 1965, DeBakey's face appeared on the cover of Time. Surgeons had achieved not just prominence, but star status. A few months later, when the television nations of the world exchanged pictures via the newly launched Early Bird satellite, watched by over 200 million people, Michael DeBakey demonstrated his powers to the world.
He is professor for surgery, Baylor University College of Medicine, and senior attending surgeon at the Methodist Hospital. And now, by Early Bird, hopefully, we are going to go to the Cantonal Hospital in Geneva, Switzerland. Here, in the Polyclinic Auditorium, are gathered doctors and nurses and medical students in this building. Today, these experts, including
heart surgeons who were capable of doing this kind of surgery, became star figures. I mean, they were like basketball players. They seemed invincible. They weren't, but they seemed that way. And that kind of aura was important to win the confidence of the patient. After all, the patient has a very rough time. He knows that something has to be done. And here he's going to this guy who he had maybe met 2 or 3 days earlier, and who's going to tells him that you're going to stop his heart, you're going to put him on a machine which is going to take the place of his heart, not only the heart and lungs. For a period of time, you're going to open his heart up, and you're going to make certain repairs inside of the heart, like replacing a valve, or sewing up a hole, or today in doing a bypass. And, you know, I mean, that is a tremendous thing if you stop to think about it. I think that somebody approached me whom I didn't know and said, he's going to do this to me. I'd say, what, yeah, are you crazy? Are you out of your mind?
There seemed to be no end to what they could do. After the large vessels, they turned to the smaller ones, like the coronary arteries, which supply the heart itself. Surgeons like DeBakey showed how blockages in coronary arteries could be bypassed by veins taken from the leg. This procedure has become one of the most common operations in the surgical repertoire. Some 20 years after Dwight Harkin had first stuck his finger into a heart, most of the easy things had been done. Few could do them as well as DeBakey, but they would learn. Contrary to the superstition that the heart was a forbidden organ, it had proved to be the ideal surgical object. It could be repaired with stitches. Its diseased parts could be replaced with synthetic substitutes. Patients recovered very quickly and went on to lead new lives.
In the past, people would walk past the cardiac theater with the view that, oh, well, perhaps they're going to die. Not anymore. It's not so. It's the other operations that are now more tricky and more difficult. You cannot imagine how incredible it is to have started a career as a doctor, moved almost immediately, I had become one, into the beginnings of what has gone through almost to its final end in one working lifetime. You can't ask for anything more exciting than that.
The descendants of a crude and brutal craft tradition, these heart surgeons had become public figures of fame and glamour. A once lowly craftsman had risen to the top of the medical hierarchy and now abounded with a new self-confidence. The image the surgeon projected was that of a man with a clear and simple vision, a man of courage and action, a miracle worker who relished solving the problems which other doctors could do nothing about. Inspired by the success of these heart operations, surgeons in other areas began pushing back the frontiers in their fields. The public was fascinated with these new heroes, and they received constant television attention as they performed complex surgery on tiny babies and routinely operated on the eyes of elderly patients, removing cloudy lenses and replacing them with artificial substitutes.
This is the cataract which I have just removed.
And orthopedic surgeons like John Charnley were offering hope to thousands crippled with arthritis. Medicine had been able to offer them little. The bold surgical solution was to cut out the damaged hip and replace it with an artificial ball and socket.
Now, those two patients originally were severely disabled with osteoarthritis, and now they have artificial hip joints. Let me try to explain what we've done. We've cemented the steel head into the thigh bone, and we've cemented the socket into the bone of the hip. And we have, in this way, a very low friction combination.
Heart surgeons like DeBakey were also interested in artificial replacements as a way of solving the outstanding problem that remained in heart surgery: how to save patients whose very heart muscle was diseased beyond hope, how to replace the heart itself. Most American surgeons favored replacing the damaged heart with an artificial substitute, but a minority thought that a heart transplant, a procedure which had worked with kidneys, was a better bet. Two graduates of the University of Minnesota were of this opinion: Norman Shumway and Christian Barnard. But in 1966, most of the attention was focused on artificial devices. To the men who had achieved so much, like Kantrowitz and DeBakey, it seemed as if they were on the verge of yet another breakthrough.
Now, the way it works, of course, is that the blood is brought up into this chamber, and if you watch here, you'll see when I blow into this, that plastic material is what forces the blood out of the chamber.
In 1966, a confident Dr. DeBakey set out on what looked like the final conquest for heart surgeons. In a daring and much publicized operation, he implanted an artificial pumping device in a patient. This was not a total artificial heart, but a simple pumping device to assist one side of the heart. It would be left in place for a few days to help the patient's own heart recover. With spectacular successes like this, it seemed as if the heart surgeon was on the road to solving all his problems. Few realized then that replacing the heart would turn out to be far more difficult than anything they had tried before.
It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Dr. Michael E. DeBakey, who has a few minutes to talk to you, and he will explain the situation in detail. I hope we do not prolong it too long, because he feels that he should be with the patient as quickly as he can.
They ask if it is an extremely difficult operation, or can it be done by surgeons around the world once they've attended your briefings and films?
Oh, certainly. This is not a difficult operation for any team that is experienced in cardiovascular surgery. They can...
It was just the personality of these people. They were the kind of people who did not really seriously consider the possibility that they were wrong. I mean, they just understood that they were right. These were the men who started modern heart surgery. And with it came an enormous development, a tremendous blooming from operating on 10 or 20 or 30 patients to first hundreds of patients, then thousands of patients, and now hundreds of thousands of patients every year.
Next time on Nova, Christian Barnard replaces a heart, not with an artificial device, but a human heart transplant, and becomes an international celebrity.
To the professional man, it was something really different, taking out the heart from one person and put it into the body of another. And of course, a lot of people, the lay people, thought, you know, that it must be a special man who can do things like that.
New organs for old. Next time on Nova.
And next time, as we continue this series on the pioneers of surgery, will be Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock, and Nova is also shown here at Saturdays at noon, as you've just seen. And next this Saturday afternoon, Robert McNeil guides us through Canada in the first of a series about the relationships between this country and Canada and what Canada is as a nation. That'll be followed by single beds and double standards, a look at Hollywood in the days of the Purity League, what films were like before the Hays Commission and after. That'll be today at 2. And later tonight, on Nature, we'll examine some of the endangered species of Japan and what Japan is trying to do to save them, including some varieties of turtle. And then Conserving America focuses on our wetlands and how important they are to all of us in the ecosystem, as well as to the birds that use them. That'll be at 9 tonight. And tomorrow evening, Luciano Pavarotti starts his new season with a recital from the Metropolitan Opera House, accompanied by James Levine.